Hello, and welcome to Planetside 2. In the last video, we covered how you should spend your certs in the early game to help you be flexible and ready for any threat you come across on the battlefield. But what if you're having a hard time aiming at people, or juggling all of your equipment? This is where settings and infantry keybindings come into play. In this episode, we're going to cover basic in-game settings to help you get better at aiming, and we'll also look at the theory behind how you should set up your keybindings to make it easier to play quickly and effortlessly. First, we'll have a look at aiming because it's the easier problem to fix. Start by opening your in-game menu by pressing escape and navigate to your settings by pressing the settings cog in the bottom right of your screen. Then select the general tab. You want to lower all of your infantry sensitivities. These are mouse sensitivity, scoped mouse sensitivity, and aimed mouse sensitivity. You can do this by either using the slider or by typing the value that you wish to apply. The general mouse sensitivity controls the speed you turn while hip firing. The aimed mouse sensitivity controls how quickly you turn when aiming using a scope with 4 times magnification or lower. The scoped mouse sensitivity controls how quickly you turn when aiming with a high-powered scope that is 6 times magnification or higher. I use 0.1 these days, but it took me several months of gradually reducing my sensitivity to feel comfortable using it. So don't be too discouraged if it feels awkward at first, but lowering your sensitivity to the point you're using your arm to aim as opposed to your wrist will make a huge difference. And why not start honing your muscle memory early? Next, you want to disable mouse acceleration because you want full control of your mouse and you don't want some software trying to predict where you want your cursor to be. Next, if you found that your computer is struggling to provide you with smooth gameplay, you can go to the Graphics tab and go to the Shadow Quality drop-down menu and select Off. Shadows are one of the biggest performance killers in this game, so disabling them should help dramatically. There's no confirm button. Simply by hitting escape to exit the menu will apply your new settings. Now let's move on to infantry keybindings. But before we start, I want to mention that these are suggestions and what works for me. If something doesn't make sense for you or doesn't feel right, then do whatever feels right to you. But just remember this general take-home message. Think about what the most critical options you want available to you are at critical moments in your gameplay, and make sure that those are the most readily available keys for you to press. Then think about what keys might not be critical, but you'll be pressing often, and make those the second most readily available keys. Then, think about what keys aren't really important, but you might want available for easy access every now and again, and bind those. You can access your key bindings by once again opening your in-game menu by pressing escape, navigating to the settings, and choosing key bindings. Then, you'll have key binding options for general gameplay, infantry, vehicles, and aircraft. We're just going to be looking at infantry today. So, what are my critical keys for infantry gameplay? Well, obviously my movement keys are critical, and that doesn't just mean WASD, it also means spacebar, left control for crouch, and shift for sprint. Those are the ones that should be obvious to anyone. If you get caught out of position, the first thing that you're going to want to do is move, in any direction you want, to either find cover or throw off your opponent's aim. But those aren't my only critical keys. I also think that your ability, utility, primary and secondary weapons, and knife are all critical keys. But what should you bind those to? Your left hand is already entirely tied up with all your movement options. I bind all these options to my mouse buttons. I have a mouse with 2 thumb buttons, and I highly recommend getting a mouse with a couple thumb buttons for any games you play. It also has a mouse wheel that goes in 2 directions and depresses like a button. This totals 5 options for me to bind. Okay, so let's get started on binding my critical abilities. First, Gear Slot 1 is your primary weapon, so I bind that to mouse wheel up. Then Gear Slot 2 is your sidearm, I bind that to mouse wheel down. Then I bind Use Ability to one of my 2 thumb buttons, and my utility slot to the other thumb button. Lastly, I bind Equip Melee to my scroll wheel button. Now your scroll wheel button is bound to Quick Knife by default, so you can see that my melee attack now has no binding. I switch my melee attack, my Quick Knife, to F, just because that's the same as every other first-person shooter game I know. So, what these first set of options allow me to do is have totally free movement, sprinting, crouching, jumping, and swapping to whichever weapon or tool or anything that I want with a lot of ease. Next, let's move on to non-critical keys. These keys include things like your enemy spotting key, your interact key, your reload key, your tool key, and your grenade key. I leave all these as default, but if you don't have a mouse like mine and some of your critical keys ended up overriding some of these, bind them now. I should note that your spotting key is actually found in the General tab, not the Infantry tab. Down here, Spot Enemy. Next, let's move on to your convenience keys. These include keys such as your minimap zoom keys, your minimap expansion key, your world map key, and your redeploy key, as well as any other keys you may want to bind for convenience. Your minimap zoom is bound to your mouse wheel by default, but because I use that for selecting my weapon, I need to bind my minimap zoom increment and decrement to something else. I use open and close square brackets. This allows me to zoom my minimap if I desperately need to, but I generally find I don't change my map zoom too often. Okay, hopefully this has helped you think about which actions and gear should be bound to which keys to really help you streamline your gaming. If you're still having performance issues with shadows disabled, you can simply go back to your graphics settings and set overall quality to very low. Bump up your texture quality to ultra, disable smoothing, and reduce your render distance to 2000. This will give you about 95% of the performance you can squeeze out of this game without getting too technical. You can also reduce render quality to get moderate performance gains, but I wouldn't recommend it because it pixelates your image and it makes you feel like you're going cross-eyed after looking at such a blurry image after just a few minutes. So try to keep this at 100% if you can. So, you're all set. You've got some decent class options available to you, and now you have a relatively smooth gaming experience and a comfortable keyboard layout that will help you utilize those options. You go out to have some fun, and you come across a notification that looks something like this. What's an implant, and how did I get it? To find out, you'll have to watch the next episode where we'll cover implants and directives.